Okay, everybody. We're going to get underway with our first panel of the day. And it's a real pleasure to introduce this. So this is our panel on security, privacy, and the IoT. It's the Passcode panel. And when I was talking with Mike and Passcode about doing this event again in the second year, one of the things that came up very early was we really wanted to focus on some of the sort of policy and lawmaking implications of Internet of Things technologies, because it's not merely just lots of new endpoints and trying to secure new endpoints. Obviously, there's the ways in which Internet of Things technologies are going to permeate all of our lives, from wearable devices to connected vehicles, connected smart infrastructure, smart industry, health and embedded devices and health devices. It's incredibly intimate. It's incredibly pervasive, and there are huge policy and privacy and security implications. And so that's what this panel is about. I'm going to pass the mic over to Michael Farrell of Christian Science Monitor, and he's going to introduce the amazing panel he's put together. But enjoy.
Thanks again, Paul. Hello again. So yeah, we'll just get started right away. As Paul mentioned, I think what we want to do is really get into a lot of the, probably chiefly some of the privacy concerns about Internet of Things, and also sort of take a look at the regulatory landscape. And to do that, we have Julie Brill to my left, Commissioner at the FTC. You've been there for
a little over 5 years.
5 years, and in those short 5 years, you've made a big impact. I think you've been called the most important voice on privacy on the FTC, right? So really happy to have her here and to bring some of the Washington perspective on this to Boston. And to her left is Andrea Matwyshyn, like magician. And she's also somehow connected to the FTC. In a previous job, you were an advisor to the FTC on some of these topics. Now you're at Northeastern, formerly at Princeton and Stanford, so you know your stuff, you've been around. And to her left is Peter Lefkowitz of GE, Chief Privacy Officer, and one of the biggest companies in the world dealing with privacy. So that's great to also have Peter here as well, who can talk about, well, what's going on with not only connected fridges, but also wind turbines and medical devices and jet engines and all of these things GE is involved in. So, with that, we just want to kind of get into it. And I'm going to, first, I want to ask Julie sort of what is the state of things in Washington when it comes to policy around the IoT. Certainly, there's been a lot in the news: hacked cars, hacked devices, and also the recent decisions that have come up that have sort of had some backlash in the industry about should we be scared of the FTC? You are the chief cyber cop in this room, so maybe you could just kind of give us the lay of the land.
Sure, happy to, and it's great to be here. So thanks for having me, and thanks for having this conversation. So, what's going on in Washington, just writ large, in terms of the Internet of Things, is there's a great desire. It's almost like a schizophrenic approach, if I have to be honest about it. On the one hand, people very much want to ensure that the Internet of Things has an opportunity to flourish. I think that policymakers are listening very closely to academics and to companies, researchers and others, who are saying, look, there's a tremendous opportunity with respect to the Internet of Things in terms of improving health, in terms of improving transportation, environment. I could go through all the case issues that demonstrate all of that. You guys know that perfectly well, so I don't need to go through those facts, but we get that. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think there's a great desire to ensure that the incredibly pervasive information that will be garnered through the Internet of Things. Much more so than just kind of the surfing the web type of stuff, but what's happening in a home, where people are going in their cars, what they're, in terms of their apps, their daily lives. That intimate collection of information is going to increase the privacy concerns that we've already been dealing with, as well as the security concerns, and not just security around the data that's being collected and analyzed and used, but also the security of the devices themselves. And we've talked a little bit about that. I'm sure we'll talk more about the hacking into cars and medical devices as well as baby monitors. So Washington, many of us who are really thinking hard about this get that, and get that we have to take an approach where we're going to allow the Internet of Things to flourish, to bring the benefits that are promised and that we're starting to see, but also ensure that we have appropriate security protections as well as data protections. So I'll just mention that we did a report about a year ago. It actually came out in January. The final version of the report came out in January, where we talked about the Internet of Things. We talked about both the benefits, the concerns, and we made some recommendations. And the recommendations that we made, first and foremost, focused on security. So it fits right in with this conversation, where we recognize, look, privacy is deeply important, and we need to be thinking about the privacy of all this data. But job number one with respect to the Internet of Things is security, because of all the vulnerabilities that we were seeing. Just one factoid I'll throw out, and again, you guys know this as well as anybody. You know, Hewlett-Packard found that 90% of connected devices are collecting personal or linkable information. And we consider linkable information, that is linkable to an individual, to be personal information at the FTC. So 90% of the devices are collecting what we call personal information, and 70% of that information is flowing over unencrypted networks. The vulnerabilities that are created not only through, for that one device, but also the entry that a device can then bring into an entire system is just enormous. And of course, we're seeing the results of that in terms of some of the breaches we're dealing with. So job number one is security. Job number two is figuring out how to deal with privacy issues when many of the objects that are going to be connected are not going to have a user interface. So it presents challenges to giving notice and choice in sort of the traditional way, but these are challenges that I think can be met, and I hope that we'll drill down into that a little bit. And there are lots of other issues that need to be addressed with respect to the Internet of Things, but I would say, number one, security. Number two, trying to figure out how to address privacy issues, how to deal with the FIPS, not whether we should, but how. Number three, we did not recommend Internet of Things specific legislation, but we think there is other legislation that needs to be enacted in order to protect consumers more broadly. Data security legislation, data broker legislation, and baseline privacy legislation as well. I think problem number four that we addressed in the report, and I hope we talk about this a little bit, is the economics of the Internet of Things. And by economics, what I mean is, for many companies, for GE, for large companies, the idea of pushing through patches and making sure that their customers are well taken care of in terms of security, that's something that, we don't worry about as much with GE. But for smaller companies, or for companies that may be sort of new to this space, that is new to security issues, haven't been in InfoSec for a long time, they're going to develop a connected pen or a connected, shoe or a wearable, a T-shirt. And if they find a vulnerability or they just develop version 2.0, they're not going to worry so much about patching that old product. But there are going to be a lot of consumers who are still going to have that product out there. So how do you deal with the economics of ensuring that consumers who are using products that maybe now are out of date get up-to-date security in their product that they're actually using? So those are just four of the concepts I'll throw out now in terms of what we are thinking about, and we'll get into some of the recommendations, I know, as we go.
So Peter, as the corporate guy on the panel, does all of this talk about new regulation, and legislation make you a little bit nervous?
No. So the shocking line, the shocking revelation is that I agree with Julie. I think security is job one. There is absolutely no question security is job one. Look, we make connected airplane engines. We make connected wind turbines. We make connected power and water stations. Those have to be secure. So we're very focused on that. There are a lot of industry standards. There are a lot of rules set out by the various agencies. The FDA came out with guidelines, and I put guidelines in air quotes, but they're guidelines for connected products and systems. God help the company that doesn't follow them from a regulatory perspective. So that's why I say guidelines. But we're very focused on securing the devices. And I think that no matter where we wind up with the rest of the issues, that is job one. On the privacy issues, to build upon what Julie was saying, we do have to think about the FIPS. We have to think about data minimization where appropriate. We have to think about notice and consent where appropriate. But it's a very, very complicated issue. And thankfully, the FTC took that on in the staff report. And I commend to all of you, if you have the time, read the staff report. I don't agree with everything that's in it in my corporate role, but I think that by and large it sets out a very good tenor. And one of the things that it says is it's simply different on a 20-inch screen than it is when you're the patient who goes to a hospital, who's sent to a medical group, who's sent to a CT scan, which then takes an image of you and sends it back to GE or Siemens to read the result and to fix the product. Very different framework in terms of notice and consent. Or if you're the passenger in seat 16C, as I was yesterday, and they need to know how much you weigh so they can check pitch, roll, and yaw on the airplane and figure out whether a certain part that's connecting the engine to the plane is responding appropriately. So yes, there are privacy implications. I think the larger message there, and the one that is quite important to us as a maker of internet-connected devices, is to make sure there's an understanding that, yes, there is the world of iPhones collecting health information and baby monitors, but there's also the world of connected engines and connected CT scans and connected RFIDs that measure whether people are washing their hands in hospitals. And the latter, from my humble perspective, incredibly important areas of development for society. And we need to make sure that in developing these rules, we're very focused on security. We all know we can get there on security. It's fairly linear. But on the other issues, there's a much, much more involved, much more complicated discussion that we need to have over time with industry, with the regulators, with the security community, with all of you, to make sure that we get it right and that we don't break down the possibility of evolution and building in this space.
So the most frightening thing I heard in that was that United knows how much I weigh.
They don't know how much you weigh. They know how much a certain barcode of something that's disassociated
But they know
weighs.
they know where I'm sitting too.
They know where you're going.
They
know
say,
where
you know,
who
it
you
all.
are. Andrea, are you sort of on the, where do you fit in sort of the thinking about where regulation needs to go in this space?
So I'll try to be a little controversial as the
Perfect.
academic on the panel. So certainly the discussions that we're having about these issues and the points that we've heard are incredibly important, and security enables good functionality, it enables privacy, it enables consumer trust, absolutely dispositive. Whether more regulation is the way to go depends on what the regulation says, because there have been some regulatory proposals that would damage the innovation in the ecosystem. And so this is a situation where we need a regulatory scalpel, not a regulatory axe. And certainly the enforcement activity of the FTC is helping to highlight the importance of these issues, because the FTC's approach is one that complements and is in line with best business practices. It makes sense. But when we start to apply a heavier lens and give certain companies' preferences over other companies with limitations of liability or something along those lines that experiments in an overly aggressive way with regulatory intervention, we're disrupting innovation rather than facilitating it. And so it's a delicate ecosystem that we're working with. The next point that I'll make that will be maybe a little controversial is the point of technology suitability. I call it the better with bacon problem. Just because we can add Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or some other newfangled technology doodad to a particular innovation, it doesn't mean that that's optimal. So there are certain types of technologies that for reasons of security, safety, need to be air-gapped, or there are consumers that simply don't want the most technology-enhanced version of products. And so consumer choice means having both the highly connected device that talks to all the things, but also the not connected device, because that may be what an entire market segment is more comfortable with in particular situations. And so you'll have differentiation in the market and the opportunity for different product lines based partially on privacy and security concerns. And whether you can game the pricing on that, I leave to the business people. But there's certainly a market opportunity for less connected devices, because it seems like everything is now being connected to the greatest extent possible. So that's one point. The last point that I'll make and open up for conversation, one of the key focuses in DC across agencies is the idea of information sharing. But in order to enable the information sharing ecosystem, we need to do some groundwork first. So when you look at the average quality of security advisories that are coming out from companies, and I'm going to annoy some people in the room, and I apologize, but I spend too much time reading this stuff. When you look at the average quality of security advisories, sometimes there aren't CVE references, sometimes there aren't CVSS scores, sometimes there aren't details that would be incredibly useful for the purpose of a meaningful snapshot of the overall security of our economy. And these information-rich type of security advisories would help for customers, business people to get a handle on what their own systems are most exposed to and how they're exposed, what libraries are included, how these libraries are impacted, what is it that they really need to do as a first-order action item. The more information that is provided transparently in terms of security advisories and other communications and the free flow of information through a cooperative disclosure process with security researchers, these are core preemptive parts that need to be put in place before meaningful information sharing can happen across agencies, across our system in general. And unfortunately, not every agency is as sophisticated as the FTC on these issues. And so one of the challenges that exists in DC is that different individuals sometimes define the framing of the issue differently enough that there is a definitional conflict and an impediment to meaningful information sharing because of the contradictory framings. And so getting that baseline of understanding and putting the building blocks in place to support a meaningful ecosystem of information from the ground up and give consumers the information they need to be able to make informed decisions and reward the companies and products that put value on security in the marketplace by picking the products that have a track record of better security and companies that care about security. Using market mechanisms like that, that is in many ways a more important step and a market nudge than many of the general categories of legislative proposals that I've seen.
So it seems like, there's a bit of a consensus right now that, we just are asking people to do good, right? We want them to, we want companies to make the best choices when it comes to security and privacy. Some do, some clearly don't. But how do you motivate companies to make the best choices when it comes to security and privacy? Not everyone has privacy policies. Not everyone has a chief privacy officer. Clearly, we know that there are lots of devices that have horrible security.
I think everyone
right?
should have a chief privacy officer.
Yes.
Job security.
Well, the truth is, so we use a carrot and stick approach or kind of a push and pull approach, right? So we engage in enforcement, as Andrea and Peter mentioned, and we have brought some cases in the Internet of Things space, including a video camera service that was called TrendNet that provided video cameras that were used for baby monitoring and others. We've recently heard about baby monitor hacks, but this is sort of not a new situation. We brought a case involving a company whose video feeds, and these were video feeds that were occurring in the home, not only looking at babies from a remote location, but also other intimate scenes were being video recorded, and the videos were hacked and appeared in the clear on the net, and we brought a case saying that TrendNet did not engage in what we call reasonable security. So what we look for in our enforcement actions is reasonable security. We recognize that, and as our opening speaker, Gottfried, mentioned, there is no such thing as perfect security. We shouldn't be striving for 100% security because on day one, you've got day 0, perfect security. Day 1, it's no longer perfect. So we do very much look instead for reasonable security. And there was just a case that came out of the Third Circuit that said, because this had actually been a little bit controversial. We didn't think it should have been controversial, but it was controversial as to whether or not the Federal Trade Commission had the authority to engage in enforcement actions requiring reasonable security. And we did it under what's called our unfairness jurisdiction. Our statute says that we can prohibit unfair and deceptive acts and practices in commerce, as well as unfair methods of competition. So what is an unfair act in commerce? We said failing to provide reasonable security was unfair. And we've been saying this for about 10 years. Most of the activity that we were engaged in terms of enforcement resulted in consent decrees. But one company, actually a couple of companies now have decided to litigate this issue. And the Third Circuit just a week or two ago came out with a decision that said, yes, the FTC's authority for to prohibit unfair acts in commerce includes the ability to prohibit activity that does not rise to the level of reasonable security. So we engage in enforcement. That's the stick, if you will. The carrot is that we also put out a lot of information in terms of what are best practices. And I have in my briefcase, I didn't bring up here with me, we've recently put out a guide that's called Starts with Security, and it's a very user-friendly document designed for startups to look through what have our cases shown and what should you be looking for and what could cause a company to get into trouble. We have lots and lots of other material on our website and that we give out to folks to try to help them sort of, what are the beginning things that they should be thinking about in order to avoid getting into trouble with the Federal Trade Commission. We are also starting a program where we're going around to communities, to developer communities in particular around the country, having conferences. We had one just yesterday in San Francisco. We're going to have one in Austin. We're going to be going to Seattle. I don't know when we're coming to Boston.
That's the Start with Security.
Starts with Security. This is
Right.
all the Starts with Security effort, and that's what the pamphlet is called too. And it's just designed to sort of say, here are the things that you should be looking for as a startup, as a newish company, or a company that's been around for a while in terms of not only avoiding FTC enforcement action, but also what are the best practices that we recommend. And our Internet of Things report included a blog that did a deep dive into the kind of security measures that we think would be most appropriate with respect to entities that are looking into developing connected devices.
So I don't think we'll have somebody here later in the afternoon from Underwriters Laboratories, but I don't want to steal his thunder, but is there a role for some other entity other than the FTC to tell consumers that, yeah, this one gets a check for great security and great privacy? Because as a consumer, not only do we not really know what's happening with the data on the back end, we don't know if these devices are secure at all. So how?
Yeah, it's a credence. I mean, it's a credence goods, right? Security, privacy. These are things consumers can't figure out, right? You absolutely need to have whether it's the company engaging in best practices and really kind of drilling down and doing not only privacy by design, but security by design and building all of this under the hood. It's absolutely something that consumers can't figure out on their own. SEAL programs, whether it's through United Labs or whether it's through some other entity or an SSO, standard setting organization, we think they all have really important roles to play and can be very helpful. It needs to be a good program. It needs to be a real program that has teeth for enforcement if someone claims that they have satisfied whatever United Labs sets up, but they don't, right? So that's something we very much look for. But absolutely, there is a role for self-regulatory standard-setting bodies, no question.
Anybody else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, the role of third-party audit is absolutely essential, because even when we are at the top of our game and trying to code things well, or in law land, write a memorandum well, you're still going to miss a comma. You're going to make an error in your code because we're human, and code is written by humans for humans. And so you need second, third, fourth sets of eyes to help you catch those mistakes and improve your products. And that includes security researchers in the ecosystem, that includes your hired third-party audit that's performed by trusted contractors. That includes an independent body like an underwriter's laboratory, and the media piece of it, where the information is translated to assist consumers in making decisions that reward companies in the marketplace that invest in best security practices.
So Peter, you probably already have to deal with all these third-party laboratories when sending out light bulbs and refrigerators. Do you want to deal with another one?
Well, I think the answer is that between the regulatory piece and the consumer confidence and trust piece, we have a lot of incentive to get it right. The difference between 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when the breaches began and resulted in the California Shine the Light law, and the time since then when laws like that have proliferated and things have wound up on the front page of the paper, is that when you have a big breach now of a product, of a service, of something that really fundamentally is a secure device, no offense, Julie, your first concern is not the FTC, it's the front page of the Wall Street Journal. So,
I'm okay with that.
right. So I think the answer is we have lots of incentive to do the right things. I don't know that I'd agree that you absolutely must have the second, third, fourth parties. I think it's going to be very product and sub-industry and space and movement dependent. How quickly you're moving with your product, how established the standards are in that space. To use an example, and perhaps an extreme one, the standards around airplane engines and airplane engine design have been in place a really long time. And the guys that do security for us in our aviation wing, including in the software part, have been doing this in a very regulated space for a long time. So is there a really important place when you're putting out the connected baby monitor to be able to say to the consumer, I've got this UL or trustee or whatever seal? Yes. Is it going to be as meaningful for us that we have that little seal on the side of the engine that's sitting on a Boeing plane? Not so much. So the answer is we need trust, we need validation, we need to make sure that we have the confidence of the public, of the customers, and of the regulatory community. But there are lots of ways to get there, and it's going to be context dependent.
How, one thing that, we talked a little bit about and, leading up to this is how GE has transitioned right to a company that's putting out a lot more connected devices. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that evolution. I mean, sure. Your job's there, so you're looking at all of these things. But so how does that translate to the people developing products?
Well, so here's the little secret. Before we ever got into predicts and predictive analytics, we had 6,000 pieces of software. We're one of the largest software manufacturers in the United States. We have a big setup in San Ramon, California. We actually just put out a set of ads of an engineer who had gotten a job at GE Software, and all of his engineering friends and family are shocked. Why would you go to GE, right? So we've been in this space a very long time. Where the attention is coming now is we've made a very big push on what we're calling the industrial internet. And what that doesn't do is fundamentally change what we do. What it fundamentally does is it brings attention to this as an area for us, and that's important. Now, how do we go about doing that? We have developed a corporate product security standard requiring security by design, privacy by design, code reviews, measurements of new product introductions and old product fixes. We have reviews right up through the risk committee of the board and on a bi-monthly basis with the chairman of the company. So this is getting a lot of attention, a lot of attention. And I think that for lack of a better term, the advertising campaign about predictive analytics has caused more attention within the company, which is a very good thing. Beyond that, a lot of it is the ongoing paranoia about the whoopsies. So, and that's something that drives engineering.
You said the...
So it's the
okay.
whoopsies.
Just wanted to make sure I heard that right.
Yes,
Whoopsies.
that's the technical term lawyers use for when you have an incident that hasn't been resolved quickly. The big thing that is very complicated that we need to think about, and that I think the industrial community needs to think about, is the old products that are out there. The new products, to Julie's point, the new products you can structure, you can do secure coding, you can do code reviews, you can do peer reviews, you can do CVE and CVSS scoring, you can do all those things that we're accustomed to. When you have a box that's sitting out on a state highway in Oklahoma that's doing giga to mega conversions, right? And that has a little controller about that big with no password on it, that's where you really have to think about what you're going to do, particularly when you can't take that system down.
Right.
So we're very focused on the area. It comes from a lot of angles. It comes from the standards angle. It comes from the executive attention angle. It comes from the angle of every time we want to put out a new product or get into a new space, thinking about what could go wrong.
Yeah. So there's one of the, I think you brought this up early on, this idea of maybe we should have, when you ship devices that are connected, the technology within those devices should have an expiration date, right? We know that a lot of people, a lot of companies never update their software. That's the cause of many vulnerabilities and hacks and things like that.
Right.
I mean, what's your take on that, you know, all three of you, on that idea, and just, is that even
Well,
possible?
my perspective is how would consumers deal with that? So it might be one thing for the company to be thinking this has an expiration date, but will the company then go out and sort of pull back all the products? I mean, even if you stop supporting a product, right, consumers may still be using it. So I think we need to not just be thinking about what is the expiration date from a company's perspective or the software engineer's perspective, but what are consumers going to be doing with that product after it expires? And you know, again, I think it's an economics problem. It's a fundamental business equation that companies are going to need to face. Again, you know, Peter's fabulous. GE does some incredibly sophisticated things. I'm worried, though, not just about the GEs of the world, but the really small players who are thinking, hey, you know, we're going out with 2.0. Let's not worry about 1.0. That's expired now. And we'll put out a notice on our website, you know, we're not supporting it anymore. But consumers might still be using that.
Or you could just have it die. I mean, you could have
Maybe, maybe not. It depends how it's functioning. So, it depends how it's functioning, what system it's in, whether it's in a connected home and it's still operating and all of that. So I have no problem with the idea of expiration dates, but I think we need to be thinking much more. There are a lot of people who are thinking about it from the consumer's perspective. I am encouraging folks to think about issues like that, expiration date, from the consumer's perspective. Will the consumer understand, and will you either be able to shut that product off, or will you be able to effectively communicate with consumers that that product is no longer being supported and you've got a vulnerability there? And I question, depending upon the product, whether consumers will really understand what's going on.
Two more points to buttress those points, which I entirely agree with. So the idea of framing the question of how long a product is in the market through this self-assigned expiration window, if that's the paradigm, isn't necessarily optimal from the security side of the house, because of course your product could be expired tomorrow depending on the severity of the vulnerabilities that are found in it by a third party. And so unless a company has a clear front door and has a receptive relationship with external third parties, whether they're customers, whether they're consumers, whether they're third-party security researchers who try to contact a company and say, hey, there's a problem in your product, can we please fix this? Without that kind of a process-based approach, a product will expire much more quickly than the desired phase-out cycle of the company would be. The second point that I'll make quickly is that when you have this type of an expiration date ripcord of sorts, and you have products in the marketplace, one which has a one-year ripcord and another which doesn't, that difference in use from the consumer perspective isn't currently being factored into the price, unless perhaps they're disclosing it in their end user license agreement, which is sometimes on the inside of the package because we have some complicated contract case law that allows for this, but I'm working on that to the extent that, I can. So the question is whether full information is present at the point of purchase for the consumer about the extent of support and usable life cycle of the product so that they can do an accurate comparison head to head when they're deciding which products to purchase and which companies to reward with their dollars.
Anything to add there, Peter? Or I can bring in the audience for questions.
Why don't you bring in the audience?
So, go ahead. Hold on 1 second. We'll get a mic for you. And the rest, yeah, so, yeah. Anybody else got questions? Just, mic's coming around.
So when we start talking about privacy, most of the time the context is in the case of confidentiality. And for me personally, a lot of people don't care about keeping their confidential data private, or the private data confidential. But where the rubber hits the road is on the integrity of the data and getting pulled into court or having your insurance denied or having some other kind of situation happen because, and oftentimes the data wasn't good to start with. And so I'm afraid that we're focusing too much, especially from a legal perspective, on privacy and confidentiality when it's really the integrity of the system where we need immediate laws to help protect people from having consequences when the data just couldn't possibly be relied upon. And rather than having those decisions go through long court battles and everything else, let's establish as much as possible up front so that we can have the frameworks when that data does start getting used to be there. And I just want comments on that.
So maybe I'll jump in on that point because what's interesting is we do have a robust law that deals with the use of data for important decision making. And that law is called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And it applies not just to credit decisions, but it applies to insurance, it applies to employment decisions, and it applies to housing decisions and other significant decisions. So when data is aggregated by an entity that puts data together from all sorts of different sources, puts it into a report, whether it's a score or an actual credit report that's used for one of these significant purposes, we actually have some pretty robust laws as to not only the integrity of the data, but the ability of a consumer to look at it, to get corrections, to ensure that it is accurate and that it is providing the best information for the purpose of those significant decisions. Now, we also, in addition to doing an Internet of Things report, we at the Federal Trade Commission also did a data broker report. Data brokers are entities that are not necessarily collecting information for purposes that fall under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but are collecting information for other purposes. And one of the most significant ones is what's called risk mitigation. And that's when information is provided to, whether it's a bank or a rental car agency or someone else, to determine whether this consumer is who they say they are and whether they are a trustworthy consumer. Now, sometimes those decisions will fall under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but sometimes they won't. We have said that the integrity, those decisions are so significant for consumers, and the integrity of that information is so important that there needs to be legislation that covers the data when it's used for those purposes, for risk mitigation purposes. And I have been a very strong advocate. One of the reasons why I've been cited as being sort of one of the most important privacy voices on the Commission is I've been a very strong advocate in making sure that the data broker ecosystem is appropriately, if we want to use the word regulated, we can, but I think what we need transparency. Consumers need to understand that all this information can be aggregated into profiles about them so that they can see it and that they can make corrections if need be, just as they can with respect to credit reports. There's a much longer conversation about this in terms of how sometimes consumers are profiled in ways that I think are deeply disturbing to most people. For instance, they can be called, whether they're a golfer, or they like cats and dogs. That's one thing, seems relatively benign. But some of the profiles that we found when we did this deep study into data brokers are things like ethnic second city struggler, or a rural and barely making it. These were the profiles, that is, segments for consumers. You know, thousands of consumers were put in these segments based on their financial status, sometimes their racial status, where they live, things like that. And these things can be beneficial. You know, we can make case studies for how they can be beneficial, but they can also be deeply harmful. So much longer conversation about data brokers, but absolutely and this comes back to the Internet of Things, because all of this deeply sensitive information that we're talking about, not just necessarily medical devices, which are can be covered by HIPAA, and not airplanes, but, you know, connected homes. All this information that is going to be gathered about us in our homes and in our cars can find its way into a data broker's profile. And that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of what you're talking about and where I have concerns.
So I just wanted to point out something in what Julie's saying that really is an important point. And it's important because we're seeing currently a dichotomy between the United States and Europe on this point. What Julie's talking about is the aggregation of hundreds or thousands of pieces of data about a person that are in the domain of the public or the quasi-public domain, that are sitting on your phone or they're sitting with a registry, and the building of that up, and whether that data should be used in one way or another. There is a very important discussion to be had in that area. And there's a very important discussion to be had about how to secure that data, how to use it, whether the data should be minimized at some point. Going back to your question about do we need a law, where Europe comes at this issue, and it's important now because they're rewriting the privacy laws in Europe. We're going to have a fundamentally new regulation, which actually is a higher level than the current directive, coming out probably next year or the year after, is with the notion that you collect data for a specific purpose. It can only be used for that purpose unless you have some other legitimate basis to use it for a secondary purpose, which usually means you have to get consent for the other purposes. Now, where that becomes problematic is it's the difference between allowing unless you prohibit or prohibiting unless you allow. And if you start from the notion that you prohibit a secondary use of data unless you allow it, you start very quickly to interfere with fixing products, developing the next product, doing health research, doing epidemiological research, and these are very, very important issues that are getting slogged out right now in Brussels. I commend Julie and I commend the FTC for really focusing in on the areas that you think are the highest risk, as opposed to coming at it from the other angle of don't allow unless you allow.
We try to get a couple more questions in here if we have time up here on the right.
I'll try to be quick. I want to build on what you were saying. Most of the conversation here follows our cultural focus for the last 15 years, which is confidentiality. I love that you're expanding it to integrity, but I want to throw a hand grenade really early in the day, so we're all expanding our scope here. I love my privacy. I want to be alive to enjoy it. And this is where packets meet flesh and blood, whether it's accidents or adversaries. And Chris's talk is going to be about the car hacking. We're going to talk a little bit more about physical kinetic response from the failures here. It doesn't even have to be deliberate. It can be accidents and adversaries. And I think too often, out of muscle memory and habit, we focus exclusively on the confidentiality. I also want to punctuate something that Andrea said. As much as I love Dan Gear and I love those sexy mutton chops, we have to drive a stake through the heart of this hand-waving idea that we can have an expiration date on these devices. If it's an industrial control system that's going to be in the field for 30 years, and on month 1 it gets a heart bleed, this is a ridiculous idea. You don't get to decide when something's going to obsolete. I think that was your point. I love him to pieces. I think he was being Socratic and provocative with that concept. I think once you add software and connectivity to something, you're responsible to both have the ability to patch it promptly and successfully, but also, to your point, we have to have the ability to crowdsource the notification and the discovery and revelation and remediation of flaws. So I think the table stakes are have a way to discover flaws in a streamlined way and have a way to respond to flaws, and also third, have a way to contain and isolate flaws. So this notion that came up last year, and a year later we should be advancing the dialogue. I don't like this expiration date as a strategy. It could be a fallback, but not a strategy. Anybody want to fight on that?
Well, I think we were all in violent agreement with you on the expiration date. I mean, I think Mike was asking the question to be provocative, but on your first point about, life and death, flesh and blood, we made very clear in our Internet of Things report, and I think we were one of the first agencies that really started focusing on, device functionality, that security is not just about data, but it's about the functionality. And we talked about car hacks, and we talked about medical device hacks, and this stuff, we're seeing new experimentation that's making the headlines, but there have been people who've been doing this research for 5 years and have done the proof of concept for, hacking into the devices and being able to halt them midstream, as they're crossing an intersection or whatnot. So this is deeply concerning, but it's not really that new of an issue. But I think we were one of the first federal agencies that really talked about the issue of, you call it flesh and blood, we say device functionality. I think we're talking about the exact same thing. It's not just about integrity of the data.
Who else?
You've got a couple people there too.
Weird question, but I had to ask. For years I've wondered, are we ever going to get to the point where it's going to be necessary to regulate the activities of consumers and households, since they are endpoints on the network and the vulnerabilities in each individual consumer's electronic systems could be leveraged to attack systems pretty much throughout the society? Are we going to get to the point where there will have to be laws and regulations saying you must do certain things with your home computer, you must have your car tested, and so forth and so on? Are we going to have to regulate the heck out of individuals to really address this problem in the long run?
You want to take that one?
So I'll answer orthogonally. This is partially my point about technology suitability. If you are a consumer and you know that you are not a security researcher and you are not an IT administrator and you are not particularly adept at managing gadgets, having the opportunity to purchase lower tech products for yourself makes you safer, your family safer, and the whole society safer. And so maintaining diversity of products in the marketplace across levels of technology connectedness, I think, is a critical piece of this puzzle to allow the people who need to get up to speed a little more the space and time to be able to educate themselves.
What about the people who aren't going to get up to speed, but who still want to use the gadgets? Those are the ones we're worried about.
Well, certainly education efforts are a critical piece of this. And so having public education campaigns and working with people to make sure they are aware that they may not be optimally educated about how to use their systems, that's step one. And then after that, we continue potentially with, we can look at the various models that have existed and succeeded in the past. But that's a conversation that's not going to happen in the next year or two. This is...
Or 10.
Right. But at the point at which we get there, the way to go about this is to look at the various regulatory models that we have used in consumer contexts across time, and there aren't that many, and see if they have lessons for us for this space. Well, so driver's licenses are one model that we've used.
Yeah,
Whether
but we
that's a
don't-
good fit
But we
is
don't
another
require,
question.
but for instance, I was thinking about driver's licenses, and my mother, who's 87 years old, God bless her, she's still driving. And I recommend everyone to stay away from Verona, New Jersey, because that's where she drives. But we don't require people to periodically get retested for their ability to drive. They do have to be relicensed and indicate whether they're wearing glasses or not, but they don't have to get retested. So, we've got, along those lines, I think that that's just not the focus. What we tend to focus on are those entities that are able to solve problems across a broader spectrum of the ecosystem than one individual. I'm not saying that there isn't an issue there. I just don't expect it to be addressed in the next decade.
And to the extent that it gets addressed, I would expect to see it on a state-by-state basis.
Possibly.
So I think we have time for one more question. Hiawatha has set the bar pretty high for provocative ones. So up there on the right.
Thanks. This is actually a serious question. Regarding the Starts With security brochure, did you send that to other folks in the federal government, other agencies perhaps, other departments?
I think what you're asking is, do we partner with other agencies so that they understand what our perspective is, in addition to the actual pamphlet? The pamphlet we're really trying to publicize this very far and wide, and we do partner a great deal with other agencies.
I actually meant, do you have a role in helping the rest of the agencies do a better job of security than they have?
OPM doesn't happen again.
Oh, is that what you're asking about? Okay. Unfortunately, I can't comment about OPM and that particular issue, but it is absolutely the case that we have some great technologists on staff, including some, sort of nationally renowned ones. Ashkan Sultani is our chief technologist right now. We've had Ed Felton, we've had Steve Bellovin. We've had some pretty big thinkers who are our chief technologists, and they absolutely are working very closely with other agencies on lots of different problems.
Well, clearly they have a big job ahead
They
of them.
do, absolutely.
So last comment, Peter?
So I'll make a very quick comment, and I've been accused in my company of telling too many stories, but I'll tell a story. I was on the airplane down to Washington, D.C. the other day, and I ran across an old friend of mine from my software days. I used to work at Oracle, who's now running a huge government consulting practice. For a long time, a lot of the civil agencies were not using the DHS system in some measure because of the politics that have surrounded a lot of the disclosures that have been coming out. And there seems to be this political security, three-letter, other divide. OPM breach happens. Now there are directives being sent out to a number of agencies, start using the DHS systems because they're quite secure. And now everyone's hiring consultants to start moving them over to the DHS systems. So in government, and I'm not professing to be an expert in government systems, but in government there are a lot of very, very complex political issues at play that probably have had something to do with the recent events.
But one thing that since we enforce privacy and security, and we've been doing data security cases for a long time, we've had a chief privacy officer at the FTC for a long time because we always looked at it as Caesar's wife. We had to be, as clean as we possibly could, which doesn't mean that we aren't going to have problems because, again, there's always, no one's going to be able to achieve perfect security, but we hold some pretty confidential information, and it's important that we keep it as secure as we can.
Well, clearly a big topic, big conversation. We'll be around. These guys will be around for a little bit if you want to find them afterwards for, if you want to pick a fight, you can try.
We're ready.
And I think Paul's about ready to bring up our next speaker. So thanks a lot. Great.
Give him a big hand.